stuff in the last couple of years. He's one of the most prolific Civil War authors we have. He specialized on the Maryland campaign of 1862, in part because he has family connections to the land where the battle was fought. So, not growing up there, but living there for a while, he looked around and said, boy, somebody ought to write about this battle.
Absolutely.
So he's been writing about the battle ever since. He's come up with some great stuff on Lee's Lost Order and other ideas, and perhaps contradictory to established history ideas of the Maryland campaign. So tonight, Alex Rossino.
Thanks very much. Very happy to be here. Honored, in fact. Just want to make sure I don't spill this all over the place. Just one correction with your trivia. There actually was fighting close to Frederick. Jeb Stuart on the morning of September 13th, from the beginning of pretty much daylight until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he and Hampton's brigade fought a rearguard action at Hagen's Gap, which is called Braddock Heights today, right atop Catoctin Mountain against the 8th Illinois and the 3rd Indiana. So there's, so Frederick, so it was all of your locations. Thanks very much for having me. I'm happy to be with such a great group of people. Today I'm going to be presenting some information that is coming up in my next book, so this isn't published yet, which is not tentatively actually, it's entitled Border State, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and the Confederate Struggle for Maryland. The book focuses on the place of Maryland and points farther north that they occupied in Confederate political and military leadership strategy, strategizing between June 1861 and September 1862, although tonight I'm going to really stop in July of 1862, you'll see why. So as I intend to demonstrate, when it came to defining an operational strategy, for fighting the war in the Eastern Theater, Confederate leaders considered Maryland and southern Pennsylvania basically inseparable. Now, by this, I do not mean to state that Confederate leaders believed that Maryland was a northern state. They most certainly did not. But what I mean to say is that when it came to planning a military operation, they realized that Maryland is not large enough to fight an extended campaign in that state. So you'd have to consider southern Pennsylvania in that as well. To put it another way, Jefferson Davis and Beauregard, General Beauregard, Joe Johnston, Stonewall Jackson, and others wanted to push the war north of the Potomac River, but they understood that limiting the fighting to Maryland would be impossible. They therefore intended to carry the conflict into Pennsylvania for military and political reasons. As a much larger state, Pennsylvania, of course, offered the space an army needed to maneuver, as well as a bigger civilian population off of which Confederate troops could live. And by pushing the war north, Jefferson Davis hoped to make that populace feel what he called the evils of war, quote unquote, and compel them to raise pressure on the federal government to make peace. Before we go any further, I want to alert you to the fact that I will be discussing Robert E. Lee in a relatively limited capacity. Histories of the 1862 Maryland campaign focus almost exclusively on Lee's planning for the operation, and he's considered the instigator of the campaign that took his army outside of the Confederacy. But I intend to demonstrate that this characterization is false. General Lee did lead his army into Maryland after more than a year of discussion and strategizing in Richmond had already taken place. He simply found himself to be the right man in the right place at the right time with the right army to do so. So let's start back at the beginning. Oop, here we go. I got to turn this on again. Hold on, am I having trouble here? Seems to be
quite on.
Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks. So let's start with a plan that Isaac Ridgway Trimble, then a colonel in the Provisional Army of Virginia, submitted to General Lee in early June of 1861, so very early in the conflict. Those of you familiar with Trimble will recall that he was severely wounded while leading his division during the ill-fated attack on the last day at Gettysburg. Trimble began the war, however, as a commander of militia in Baltimore. Several weeks after the federal military occupation of Maryland, Trimble had been forced to return to his native state of Virginia, where he joined the Provisional Army. Now, he proposed to General Lee that Confederate forces then stationed at Harper's Ferry should advance to Hagerstown, Maryland. To quote Trimble's letter that he wrote to Lee, I am so fully impressed with the conviction that an attack on Hagerstown will be successful that I ventured to present it to you. I think Hagerstown is a better point to defend Virginia in than Harper's Ferry, which must in time be turned unless the enemy is repelled. Now, the enemy to which Trimble referred was a force of 3,000 men sent from Chambersburg to occupy Hagerstown under the command of Major General Robert Patterson. Now, those troops had advanced to Hagerstown from Pennsylvania as part of Winfield Scott's effort to secure Maryland for the government, protect Washington, and to use it as a staging ground for further military operations into Virginia. Trimble argued that Southern forces could push the Federals out of Maryland and use Hagerstown to defend the approaches to the Potomac from Pennsylvania. He further desired to use Confederate presence in the state to influence the outcome of the November general election in Maryland in favor of secessionist forces by moving against Baltimore and Washington to strike a decided blow, derange all of Winfield Scott's operations, and delay his advances several months, if not lead to peace. Now, Trimble further claimed that an attack on Baltimore would revolutionize the state of Maryland and bring out in that state about 12,000 armed men who could delay the passage of troops from the north by burning bridges, etc., something that Trimble was quite good at and burned a number of them north of Baltimore. These two movements being successful, the one on Washington would probably have the effect of driving Lincoln out of that city, he said, and perhaps force a retreat from Washington down the Potomac. Trimble believed, however, that the time to enact his operation was running out because troops from the northern states were arriving in the capital city on a daily basis. These forces strengthened the Federal Army, ensuring that as time passed, the opportunity to liberate Maryland would fade away. Now, there's no evidence that General Lee ever considered acting on these recommendations. Trimble's letter, I think, is nevertheless very important because it contained ideas which nearly all subsequent Confederate plans for advancing across the Potomac would share. He argued, for example, that Southern forces should take the fight to the enemy and not give battle in Virginia if it could be helped. Confederate troops should instead fight in Maryland and Pennsylvania to knock the enemy off balance. Trimble also believed that it was important to strike first before Federal troops could be organized and trained. Spirited Southern volunteers were likely to deliver victories that might quickly win the war, he believed. The colonel also thought as well that being aggressive would sustain Confederate morale. Men defending a static line south of the Potomac River might otherwise become discouraged, his word, if the Confederate Army did not advance into Maryland. Now, Trimble also placed special emphasis on taking Baltimore to cut off Washington from the northern reinforcements and it would also prompt secessionists in the city to rise up in rebellion. Each of the elements of Trimble's plan, the call for offensive action, the desire to relieve Virginia by carrying the war into Maryland and Pennsylvania, the characterization of Southern troops as preferring aggression over inaction, the assertion that Baltimore would rise in a revolution, the hope that Washington could be attacked from the northwest and isolated, the prospect that the war could be won by taking the enemy's capital city, and the claim that military movements could shape the outcome of the upcoming general election in Maryland would appear in subsequent debates about the advantages of marching across the Potomac. Indeed, General Lee would later cite many of these in his same objectives as goals he attempted to achieve in September of 1862. Now, none of this suggests that Lee pocketed Trimble's letter in 1961 only to use it later as the basis for his expedition in 1862. There's no evidence that he did so. Rather, I'd argue Trimble's proposal was important because the ideas expressed in it appeared in plans for an invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania put forward multiple times between 1861 and 1862. So, in this sense, Trimble's ideas reflected a common approach to fighting the war held by many Confederate protagonists. This being a preference for offensive over defensive action, the belief that most of Maryland's people sympathized with the secessionist cause, the desire to fight the war north of the Potomac so as to demoralize Lincoln supporters, and the focus on isolating Washington from the northern states. Alrighty, good. So, one of the officers who shared Trimble's opinion was General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the commander of the Confederate Army of the Potomac, as the Army in Virginia was called at the time. Now, Beauregard sent an aide in James Chestnut to Davis with a plan for pushing forces over the Potomac in mid-July 1861, about 1 week before the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. Now, Chestnut was the husband of the famous diarist Mary Chestnut, as well as a Confederate congressman and a friend of Jefferson Davis. The plan that Beauregard sent him with argued for the following steps. First, unite the Army of the Shenandoah, then under Joseph Johnston, with the Army of the Potomac. Defeat the Federal commander Irvin McDowell's army in Northern Virginia. March on General Patterson's Union force in Shenandoah Valley. Defeat him and push the combined Southern force across the Potomac to arouse Marylanders to recover their rights and force a decisive engagement between Washington and Baltimore. Now, during their conference in the Executive Mansion, Davis and Lee complimented Chestnut on Beauregard's plan. But General Lee expressed the opinion, and I quote, that the time for its execution had not yet arrived, unquote. Davis agreed with Lee, who admitted upon being asked by Chestnut that they had already discussed the subject of going on the attack, but that the enemy was as yet too close to his cover. Moreover, he added that if the enemy found us with combined and superior forces before him, he might or might not give battle, but retire behind the protection of the guns of his entrenchments, and thus defeat the objects of our combination, and that in such an event we would be put to great disadvantage of achieving nothing and leaving other points exposed. Lee argued instead it would be better to draw the enemy farther from his entrenchments and by lengthening him, weaken his line, which would give us a better chance of success. If that sounds familiar, it's exactly what Lee did in September of 1862. So here we get an inkling of the concerns that would later shape Lee's operation in 62, particularly the worry of federal troops could withdraw into Washington and avoid a general battle. He therefore thought it better to draw the enemy away from that city in order to meet him in the open field and weaken his supply lines. And lastly, Davis and Lee confirmed that they had actively considered an offensive north of the Potomac, but agreed that the time for it had not yet arrived. 2.5 months later, Beauregard, Joseph Johnston, and G.W. Smith, the senior commanders in Virginia, could feel the time for action slipping away through their fingers. After winning a clear victory at Manassas on July 21st, Johnston and his colleagues found themselves unable to turn it into a lasting advantage. Now, intense criticism followed as the Confederate government in the press and in the Southern political circles wondered why Johnston had not taken to Washington and liberated Maryland after beating back the Northern invaders. The answer was that Johnston's army did not possess the men, the arms, the officers, or the supplies necessary to sustain an offensive operation. But neither he nor President Davis could announce these details publicly out of fear that it would give George McClellan, who had taken command of the Army of the Potomac, after the Manassas debacle, an idea of how weak Southern forces in front of him truly were. Johnston therefore asked Davis to visit his headquarters and discuss the possibility of reinforcing the army so that it might cross the Potomac and liberate Maryland. Now, Davis attended the meeting at Fairfax Courthouse on October 1st. Lee was not involved since Davis had already detailed him in August to repel the invasion in Western Virginia. At this October 1st meeting, Johnston, Beauregard, and Smith, a division commander under Johnston, argued that the Confederate Army of the Potomac should be reinforced to a strength of between 50 and 60,000 men, marched over the Potomac west of Washington, placed in a position behind Washington, and that provocation would then draw McClellan out of into a fight before his growing army was fully trained. Assuming a victory could be secured, Confederate forces could then bring Maryland into the Confederacy and transfer the war to the Pennsylvania line, after which Southerners would take up a defensive posture. Now, Davis listened to all of this with enthusiasm, and even brought a military engineer with him to plot out fords over the Potomac that Johnston's force could use. However, upon hearing what the generals required to enact their plan, Davis balked. The sticking points for him revolved around manpower and supplies. So, for example, Johnston and the others asked for experienced troops such as the ones they currently commanded. Davis, however, did not have the men to send him. Raw volunteers he could provide in small numbers, but not veterans. In addition, the Army lacked experienced field officers at the brigade and regimental levels, meaning the men that Davis would send him would amount to little more than an armed mob, as it did at the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, without experienced leadership in the field. Lastly, Davis could not find the weapons and ammunition required for such an offensive operation. And so therefore, faced with these crippling restrictions, all Davis could recommend was Johnston order raids into Maryland to keep the enemy off balance. So, writing later of this moment, the Confederate president recalled how after asking about the number of troops present for duty, and I quote, "To my surprise and disappointment, the effective strength was stated to be but little greater than when it fought the Battle of the 21st the preceding July. The frequent reinforcements which had been sent to the Army in no wise prepared me for such an announcement." So, strength returns from Beauregard's command confirmed Davis's claim. As of August 31st in 1861, Beauregard reported having 26,400 men present for duty, including 24,000 infantry, 1,400 cavalry, and 1,000 artillerists. An additional 8,700 men were available in the camps around Fredericksburg. Now, 1 month later, on September 30th, those numbers had hardly changed, with Beauregard reporting 27,600 men present for duty, including 25,000 infantry, 1,400 cavalry, and 1,200 artillerists, with 9,400 men at Fredericksburg. The year 1961 thus passed into history without Richmond being able to generate the force necessary to push the war north. George McClellan, by the way, believed that Johnston commanded an army of 100,000 men in Northern Virginia at this point in time. So it doesn't start on the peninsula. So the battle lines in the east thus remained at the end of the year basically where they had been at the beginning of the summer. Only the fact that Union forces had not pushed further into Virginia militated in favor of Davis and his generals. McClellan remained in his entrenchments around Richmond, and this was despite the fact that recruits had already swelled his army to 177,000 men. The Confederates basically bluffed their way for their first year of the war, much as the discovery of the Quaker guns at Manassas would show in early 1862 when the line shifted south and you uncovered painted logs in the entrenchments. And yet Confederate commanders still peered across the Potomac searching for a solution to the conundrum of how to win the war in the East. Now, Davis endured all of this alone. With General Lee busy in Western Virginia, it was the Confederate president who experienced the slings and arrows of public criticism. Now, these critiques stung the proud Davis, who endured them in silence lest he reveal Confederate weakness to the enemy by saying, "We simply can't do this because we do not have the men and material." But that criticism intensified in October as the campaigning season slipped away and nothing had been done. Worse yet, the Richmond Dispatch published an editorial on October 26th that cited General Beauregard's report on the Battle of Manassas. And in it, Beauregard had opened with a statement saying that before the battle, he had presented a plan calling for the combination of his army with that of Johnston for an attack into Maryland, but President Davis had rejected it. He didn't provide any context for why that had happened, and so the comment, of course, referred to the plan that James Chestnut had brought to the Executive Mansion just before the Battle of Manassas in mid-July. Davis, however, could not recall having seen such a plan, in part because Chestnut delivered its details verbally when Davis was ill, and also because a written summary of it from Beauregard had never crossed his desk. So understandably, Davis exploded with indignation upon reading the newspaper report. He then began a letter-writing campaign to Beauregard, Johnston, Smith, Lee, and others, seeking a copy of Beauregard's report and statements concerning the content of the plan that he was alleged to have rejected. Clearly, the president was attempting to collect information that would salvage his reputation and refute the claim that it was he who kept the Confederate Army inactive instead of the nation's dire material weaknesses. The impact of this controversy on Davis, I think, really cannot be underestimated. He had favored taking the war to the enemy since February of 1861, even before the shooting had started, when he said before as he was making his way to Montgomery to be named Confederate president, inaugurated as president, that if war comes, it will take place on the enemy's soil, not on ours. He said this at least twice. Now he had been publicly shamed for not pursuing the course that he had been unable to take, and it was an experience that he would not forget. In the meantime, other Confederate officers, unaware of the problems crippling the nation's war effort, continued to demand that they be allowed to go on the attack. One of these men is General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. Now, Jackson shared the vision of forcing the war north. Since at least May of 1861, he had requested to push troops into Maryland and occupy the heights above Harper's Ferry, Maryland Heights there. Lee had denied it to him then, due to the fact that Virginia had only just begun its mobilization and because Governor Letcher still hoped that Maryland was going to secede. Now, all of this frustrated Jackson, who decided to visit General Gus Smith at the end of October to confer on a subject of great importance, he said. Now, Smith, who was himself unwell at this time, listened as Jackson spoke while sitting on the ground next to his cot. And I quote, "McClellan with his army of recruits will not come out against us this autumn," old Jack told Smith. "But if we remain inactive, they will have greatly the advantage over us next spring. Their raw recruits will have then become an organized army, vastly superior in numbers to our own," unquote. Now, Jackson, Beauregard, Johnston, and Davis, and others shared this opinion. "We are ready at the present moment for active operations in the field while they are not," Stonewall continued, "and so we ought to invade their country now and not wait for them to make necessary preparations to invade ours." Jackson then asked for reinforcements taken from other points not threatened so that he might cross the upper Potomac and make an active campaign of invasion before winter sets in. Jackson proposed taking possession of Maryland and occupying Baltimore to enforce to cut off Washington from the northern states. These steps, he believed, would force the federal government to abandon the capital and bring McClellan's army out of its entrenchments. Jackson then promised he could destroy that army if it came out against us in open country. From there, he proposed to destroy industrial establishments wherever he found them, break up lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and if necessary, seize and destroy the manufactories and commerce of Philadelphia and other large cities in our reach. Jackson even envisioned taking the narrow neck of country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie and subsisting the army in the country that we traverse, making unrelenting war amidst their homes, and force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South in the Union at the bayonet's point. Jackson urged Smith to use his influence with Generals Johnston and Beauregard in favor of immediate aggressive operations. Smith refused, however, telling Jackson that any attempt on my part to exert influence in favor of this proposition would do no good. Jackson would still not be dissuaded. He kept at Smith, dwelling more at length on the advantages of such a strategy to ourselves and disadvantages to the enemy. Smith repeated his initial reply, explaining that these views had already been laid before the government in a conference which had taken place in Fairfax Courthouse in the first days of October. It was only after hearing this that Jackson reluctantly gave in, and rising from his seat on the ground, he shook Smith's hand, saying, "I am sorry, very sorry," before leaving the general's tent. And thus, another Confederate offensive plan had fallen by the wayside. Winter setting in put thoughts of aggressive actions on the back burner, and when the weather began to improve, the dire predictions of Jackson, Johnston, and Smith became a reality. Although George McClellan had not advanced against Johnston at Manassas, he had assembled, trained, equipped the largest professional military force North America had ever seen. Now, word of this immense army reached Davis, who ordered Johnston to fall back to the Rappahannock line in February of 1862. Johnston did so in March, only to find his position immediately outflanked by the transfer of McClellan's army to the York River Peninsula southeast of Richmond. Now, as the strength of McClellan's force grew, Confederate strength continued to languish. Davis therefore called a meeting at the Executive Mansion on April 14, 1862, to discuss the increasingly dangerous federal threat. This was attended by Joe Johnston, Gus Smith, Secretary of War George Randolph, Robert E. Lee, who had returned to Richmond after 8 months of missions elsewhere. James Longstreet also took part in this. The focus of the conversation, which lasted from 10 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock the following morning, revolved around a brief memo General Smith had written just before the meeting. Smith had submitted the paper to General Johnston a few moments before the conference commenced, and after reading the memorandum, Johnston handed it to the president, saying that he had just received it from Smith and adding that he conferred with the opinions contained therein. Davis read Smith's proposal aloud to the group, and the discussion commenced upon these written views. Now, in this memo, Smith presented two plans, one defensive and one offensive. The defensive plan proposed that all of the troops which could be spared from the Carolinas and Georgia be brought to Richmond, and that Confederate forces at Norfolk near Yorktown should be withdrawn without defending those places, thus concentrating all of our available strength near the capital. Along with these forces, Smith also recommended transferring Jackson's army of the Valley to Richmond. Once this concentration had been accomplished, the combined force could then draw McClellan from his gunboats and water base and attack him and defeat him near Richmond. Now, concerning the offensive plan, Smith proposed bogging McClellan down in a long siege of Richmond while the larger portion of the army marched rapidly across the border to make an active offensive campaign beyond the Potomac, striking Baltimore and Washington, if not Philadelphia and even New York, before McClellan could take the works around the Confederate capital. Here, Smith clearly had resurrected the attack plan that he, Beauregard, and Johnston had presented to Davis on October 1st the previous year. This time, however, he included some details that Jackson had proposed in later October. That being to not only push the army above the Potomac River, but not to stop at the Mason-Dixon line and continue on well into Pennsylvania. By the time this conference had ended, Davis supported the opinion voiced by Lee and George Randolph that they should defend the peninsula against McClellan before taking any other action. The president accordingly ordered Johnston to move his army in the direction of Yorktown to contest McClellan's advance. Now, for his part, Johnston remained deeply opposed to fighting McClellan in place, preferring Smith's proposal to march north and attack Washington. And he tried again on April 30th to sway Lee in his favor. This is not the Joe Johnston that has come down to us through history, who would have retreated to Key West if it was necessary. General Johnston wrote, "We are engaged in a species of warfare at which we can never win. It is plain that General McClellan will adhere to the system adopted by him last summer and depend for success upon artillery and engineering." George McClellan's an engineering officer, right? Makes sense. "We can compete with him in neither." Lee agreed, telling Davis later in June of 1862 that McClellan had made his advance a battle of posts. But there was little that he could do about it in April when Johnston had advised they collect all the troops available in the east and assume the offensive. "We should cross the Potomac with them while Beauregard, with all we have in the west, invades Ohio," Johnston reasoned. "Our troops have always wished for the offensive, and so does the country." Requesting that Lee submit this suggestion to the president, Johnston claimed, "We can have no success while McClellan is allowed, as he is by our defensive stance, to choose his mode of warfare." Lee did as Johnston asked, but replied the president could not be convinced, even though he also strongly preferred going on the attack. And I quote in Lee's response, "Your letter of the 30th has been received and submitted to the president. The feasibility of the proposition contained in it has been the subject of some consideration with him for some time. So far as advancing a column to the Potomac with all of the troops that can be made available is concerned. As for the proposed invasion of Ohio by General Beauregard, Davis desired that as well, but feared that it was impracticable at that point. Nevertheless, Lee assured Johnston it will also be considered. He, Davis, concurs in your views as to the benefits that could be obtained by taking the offensive, and is very desirous about carrying it into effect." So the evidence we have from Lee during this period is interesting because of what it reveals about his own thinking and the subject of pushing the war north. He and Davis agreed at the April 14 conference to take a defensive posture, just as they had in July of 1861 when James Chestnut delivered Beauregard's invasion plan. No daylight glimmered between Lee and Davis concerning what to do. If anything, it was Davis who demonstrated a more pronounced preference for going on offensive action than Lee, who seemed to favor taking a defensive tack. That's not something that you will read in much of the literature. It's almost always the opposite. Lee preferred to defend because multiple crises faced the Confederacy at that moment. While McClellan menaced Richmond, Irvin McDowell had pushed his command toward Fredericksburg. Multiple federal armies, including one under Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, had been converging on Jackson and Shenandoah Valley, too. And amidst all of this, the best that Lee could hope to do was Jackson could create a diversion which might alarm Washington into changing its course. So to that end, Lee wrote Jackson on May 16th to instruct that, quote, "Whatever movement you make against General Banks, do it speedily. and if necessary or if successful, drive him back toward the Potomac and create the impression as far as practicable that you intend to threaten him on that line. Jackson, of course, combined his force with the division of Major General Richard Ewell soon thereafter and proceeded to defeat Banks twice in 3 days, once at Front Royal on May 23rd and again at Winchester on May 25th. By May 30th, he had pushed Banks all the way back into Maryland and once again threatened Harper's Ferry. Now, these moves alarmed Lincoln so deeply that he ordered the troops intended to reinforce McClellan's army held back to deal with Jackson. Moving down the valley so audaciously had thus enabled Jackson to partially accomplish what Beauregard, Davis, and Johnston had long hoped to achieve. He pushed the war out of the Shenandoah and slowed the Federal juggernaut converging on Richmond. Jackson had therefore demonstrated the benefit of assuming an offensive posture. Now, success encouraged Jackson so much that he tried once again to get Davis to approve his plan for pushing the war into Pennsylvania. Accordingly, he asked Colonel Alexander Butler to go to Richmond with a request for reinforcements. And I quote, "Say to them in Richmond that I'll send on prisoners from the valley, secure most, if not all of the property, capture property, and with God's blessing will be able to baffle the enemy's plans here with my present force, but that it will have to be increased as soon thereafter as possible. You may tell them, too, that if my command can be gotten up to 40,000 men, a movement may be made beyond the Potomac, which will soon raise the siege of Richmond and transfer this campaign from the banks of the James to those of the Susquehanna." Once again, Jackson's thoughts had returned to the notion of relieving Richmond by advancing into Pennsylvania. Now, Butler arrived at the executive mansion with Jackson's plan on or about June 2nd. And one day later, Davis wrote the general with congratulations on the brilliant campaign you have conducted against the enemy in the Valley of Virginia. Were it practicable to send reinforcements, it should be done. Davis assured him, your past success showed us, surely you would, with an adequate force, destroy the wicked designs of the invader of our homes and assailer of our political rights. Davis, though, had no troops to send. McClellan's army had advanced to the outskirts of Richmond, forcing Johnston to engage him on May 31st at the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. So, as we know, Johnston suffered the wound at the end of that battle, which would lead Davis to name Lee the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. This development changed everything for Confederate fortunes in the East, because in Lee, Davis found a general with whom he could work. Davis and Johnston had not gotten along particularly well. Now the president had a general in place who would carry out his wishes without question. With this in mind, Davis rode out to Lee's headquarters at the Dabbs house on 9 Mile Road. Arriving as a meeting between Lee and his senior subordinates was taking place, Davis withdrew and rode to the front, where after a short time, General Lee joined him. The two men then entered into a conversation as to what, under the circumstances, Davis thought it most advisable to do. The president recommended reinforcing Jackson for a feint toward Pennsylvania. Then, after the enemy had responded to Jackson's threat, he could turn and march rapidly to Richmond for a joint attack with Lee on McClellan. Davis also urged Lee to, quote, carry the war into Africa and plant his standard on the north bank of the Potomac, unquote. Warming to his subject, Davis repeated he had held an opinion he had held since February of 1861, saying, quote, a slaveholding nation was strongest for an invasive war and weakest for a defensive war. As for Maryland, she would spring to our feet an armed border state, while around his banner, Lee's banner, an army of 500,000 of the bravest, best riders and shots from across the nation would rally. Washington City would fall, and the enemy would be compelled to fly to Havre de Grace, or ultimately to Pennsylvania, upon whose soil and not ours the battle would be fought. Peace would speedily follow. To all this, Lee replied, we have not the men. And he was not wrong. According to Walter Taylor, the Army of Northern Virginia counted 56,600 men in its ranks when General Lee took command on June 1st. This made it only slightly larger than a return of 53,700 reported on May 21st. The Confederacy's circumstances, therefore, had really not changed much from the fall of 1861, when the inability to muster combat strength compelled Davis, Beauregard, and Johnston to remain on the defensive. Help was on the way, though, thanks to reinforcements coming in from points farther south. Now, Davis had signed the Confederacy's first conscription law 2.5 months earlier, But the men pressed into military service needed time to drill before they could be effective soldiers. These new levies finally began appearing in large numbers in mid to late June, with the estimated strength of Lee's army rising to 92,000 men. The influx then continued into July, with the Army of Northern Virginia's ranks swelling to more than 139,000 men, including 128,000 infantry, 6,700 cavalry, and 4,400 artillerists. Remember, at this time, McClellan is calling for reinforcements because he is saying that he is outnumbered, when he is in fact actually at this point in time outnumbered for the first time since the war began. Lee agreed with Davis about the need to send Jackson troops, but he balked at the idea of sending men from his army because in early June he had not received the reinforcements Davis promised. Still, he continued to mull over the prospect until Jackson reported 2 more victories at Port Republic on June 8th and Cross Keys on June 9th. These triumphs finally swayed Lee to Davis's opinion, and he suggested sending Jackson 2 brigades plus a 3rd from Georgia while he kept McClellan at bay for another week to 10 days. Jackson could then drive the enemy out of the valley and then march to Richmond to help deal with the Army of the Potomac. The prospect of finally pushing the war north so excited Davis that he wrote his life on June 11th, and I quote, "I will endeavor by movements which are not without great hazard to countervail the enemy's policy. If we succeed in rendering his works useless to him and compel him to meet us on the field, I have much confidence in our ability to give him a complete defeat. And then it may be possible to teach him the pains of invasion and to feed the army on his territory." In short, although the capital remained in peril and Jackson fought desperately for his own survival, Davis still dreamed of launching the invasion that he and others had discussed since middle of 1861. Now, Jackson would need to wait, however, because General Lee learned from Jeb Stuart that the right flank of McClellan's army lay exposed to attack north of the Chickahominy River. He decided there and then against sending reinforcements to the valley in favor of calling Jackson to him on June 16th. Pushing the war across the Potomac would need to wait until after Lee had repulsed McClellan's advance. Jackson dutifully reported to Richmond, and from June 25th to July 1st, Lee struck a series of blows that forced McClellan back to Harrison's Landing on the James River. Now, Davis lauded the Army for its efforts in an address on July 5th, summoning in the process the by now familiar themes of invasion. And I quote, "Well may it be said that you have done enough for glory," he stated. "But duty to a suffering country and to the cause of constitutional liberty claims from you yet further effort. Let it be your pride to relax in nothing which can promote your future efficiency, your one great objective being to drive the invader from your soil and to carry your standards beyond the outer boundaries of the Confederacy to wring from the unscrupulous foe the recognition of your birthright, community, independence." So this period right after the end of the 7 days is very important for the evolution of Confederate military plans. After disengaging from the enemy around Harrison's Landing, Lee drew back the army to defensive positions closer to Richmond. This movement ushered in a brief period of rest that did not suit Jackson in the least. Like President Davis, he remained intent on carrying the war north as quickly as possible. Accordingly, he asked Colonel Bottler to deliver yet another message to Davis at some point between July 5th and July 7th. And if you're wondering why Jackson is not going through Lee and is actually going directly to Davis, you have to remember that Jackson is a commander of his own army in the valley. He is not subordinate to Lee at this point. Bottler recalled Jackson saying to him in a tone of considerable excitement, "Do you know that we are losing valuable time here?" "How so?" Bottler asked. "Why, by repeating the blunder we made after the Battle of Manassas and allowing the enemy leisure to recover from his defeat and ourselves to suffer by inaction." "Yes," Jackson said with increasing excitement, "we are wasting precious time and energies in this malarious region that could be much better employed elsewhere." You have to remember, Jackson is from the mountains of West Virginia, and he thinks that the lowlands east of Richmond are like the jungle. General then proceeded to argue that McClellan's army had been thoroughly beaten and that it would need to be reinforced or reorganized before it could become effective in the field. I find that fascinating that he said this after the 7 days battle, and Lee says exactly the same thing after the second fight at Manassas. Therefore, as far as he was concerned, the safety of Richmond was assured. And under these circumstances, the movement northward, which we had previously advised, should be made without further delay. "Why don't we advance?" and asked the increasing agitated general. Now is the time to advance into Pennsylvania. McClellan is paralyzed, and Scipio Africanus's policy is best. Let the president only give me the men, and I will undertake it. Now, Scipio Africanus is a Roman general who defeated Hannibal and took the war from the north side of the Mediterranean into Africa and defeated Hannibal in Africa at the Battle of Zama and destroyed his army. It's also the reference to carrying the war into Africa that Davis had used when he had said that to Lee in June. So both of these men are classically trained. They read Livy. They know about ancient Roman armies and strategy. So we always hear about Jomini and Mahan and the influence that these people had on military strategy. They're actually looking much farther back. They're looking back 2,000 years to ancient Roman history. Now, according to Butler, Jackson wanted me to take the matter to President Davis's attention, and that in doing so, to tell the president it was not from any self-seeking that he was so persistent in urging the movement, as he was entirely willing to follow any leader in making it to whom he might think it proper to designate. Jackson used Lee also to pressure Davis, informing his brother-in-law Rufus Berenger of a conversation he had with Lee at around the same time. Jackson stated, "A new phase of the struggle is in full upon us, and General Lee," this is very important, "is in great perplexity how to meet it. I have just had a conference with him on this vital point. No plan of campaign has yet been agreed upon, but I gave him frankly certain outlines of my own plan for waging the contest, which he considered favorably and which he promised to lay before Mr. Davis and try and secure his approval in whole or in part." So in other words, Lee, the vaunted, always on the offense, always the aggressor, at this point in time, was not inclined to lead an offensive into Maryland and then into Pennsylvania. The campaign plan, of course, that Jackson spoke of was none other than a version of the one that he had discussed with Smith in October of 1861 and Butler the previous June. Here he expressed agreement with Beauregard, Johnston, and others who had long advocated going on the attack as the only winning strategy for the South to pursue, given the North's advantages in men and materiel. Jackson then argued for raising the black flag against the South's enemies by adopting a hard war policy against the Northern populace. The Confederacy, he argued, must keep up ceaseless aggressions upon the enemy in the form of counter-invasions that involved organizing our whole available fighting force, so selected and located into 2, 4, or more light movable columns, specially armed and trained and equipped for sudden moves and long rapid marches. These light movable columns I would hurl against the enemy as they entered our borders, but then only when sure of victory and when the loss of an army was impossible. Jackson preferred to hurl these thunderbolts of war against the rich cities of the North, too, teeming with regions of our quote-unquote federal friends. While avoiding major clashes with federal forces, Jackson would subsist his troops as far as possible on the northern people. He would also lay heavy contributions in money on their cities. If that sounds familiar, Jubal Early does the same thing in July of 1864, commanding the Army of the Valley. Lastly, Jackson would encumber my marches with no prisoners except noted leaders, mainly held as hostages for ransom or retaliation. All the rank and file would parole, but only at the risk of life if parole was violated. Above all, Jackson desired to pursue a strategy of counterpunching against the enemy by always keeping one or more of his movable columns on the march in northern states. And on this score, he agreed with the sentiments expressed by Davis and others to, quote, make it hot for our friends at their homes and firesides all the way to Kansas, and doubly so for Ohio and Pennsylvania. Now, Stonewall voiced his black flag policy after learning that the Lincoln administration had formed a new army under the command of Major General John Pope. Lincoln brought Pope east from the Army of the Mississippi in late June as doubts grew about the results to be expected from McClellan's Peninsula campaign. Brash and prone to crippling self-promotion, Pope issued orders for his men to consider the civilian population hostile and to treat them accordingly. This included encouraging his men to forage liberally, an instruction that often translated into federal soldiers simply taking whatever they wanted from the farms in northern Virginia. Now, complaints about Pope soon reached Richmond, leading General Lee to famously declare him a miscreant in need of being suppressed. Now the need to deal with Pope's army, along with the rebuff of McClellan's force from before Richmond, prompted Davis to call a council of war at the Executive Mansion on July 13th. Lee, Jackson, and James Longstreet met with the president around midday, and according to Armistead Long, Lee's military secretary, as was, quote, as there was no probability of McClellan's immediately resuming active operations against Richmond, Lee determined by assuming the offensive and threatening the federal capital to force him into make a change of his entire plan of campaign. Davis, of course, naturally favored this decision because it would finally fulfill his long-held desire to threaten Washington and force the withdrawal of federal troops from Virginia. Lee, therefore, dispatched Jackson with 3 divisions of infantry and a proportionate amount of artillery to the neighborhood of Gordonsville, while himself remaining at Richmond with Longstreet's corps, D.H. Hill's and Anderson's divisions of infantry, and Stuart's cavalry in order to observe McClellan, who was now slowly recovering from the stunning effect of his defeat. Now, only one witness to this conference and an officer of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry named Charles Blackford wrote about the event. But while he saw the participants come and go, Blackford didn't hear what they discussed. This information soon became available in a remarkable summary submitted by the Baltimore correspondent of the New York Herald. The Richmond Daily Dispatch then republished the Herald's column on July 19th. The appearance in a northern newspaper of an important military detail spoken about behind closed doors smacks of either a potentially devastating military intelligence coup or a deliberately planted story. Rumors also surfaced after the war about domestic servants in the Executive Mansion passing information to Northern agents so they could have been the source of it. Whatever the source was, the Herald conveyed several general points corroborated by other sources. To begin with, the council's attendees unanimously agreed that it would not only not do to not lose more territory, but it would also that the territory which had been lost must be regained. The results of the defensive policy, which had been hitherto the policy of the South, were regarded as not satisfactory, and its abandonment was strongly urged. General Beauregard, misidentified as being at the War Council, and General Lee endeavored to demonstrate the feasibility of an invasion of the North at 3 different points, namely from Cumberland or Williamsport into Pennsylvania, from Louisville and Cincinnati into Ohio and Indiana, and from Paducah and Cairo into Illinois. With the exception of General Beauregard's alleged presence, the other subjects ring true. Beauregard, Johnston, and Jackson had all proposed sending columns into Ohio at earlier dates. Furthermore, Davis and Lee had discussed shifting from a defensive to an offensive posture, while Jackson had repeatedly advocated for the same policy. Only correct information passed to the Herald's correspondent could have account for the accuracy of at least some of these details. Now, according to the Herald, the July 13 conference ended with a number of operations agreed upon, including a plan to make the Potomac and the Ohio rivers at once their base of operations and the frontier line, and to transfer the seat of war from Virginia into Maryland. In addition, Lee and the others intended to hurl upon Washington from Richmond a column of 200,000 troops, and the capture of that city and liberation of Baltimore and the invasion of North at the 3 points named above. By becoming in turn the invaders, they hoped to make it necessary for us to keep at home for the defense of our city's fully 500,000 troops. Now, these objectives, although citing unreasonable Confederate numbers, were not flights of fancy. Armistead Long described Lee's objective after the conference as, quote, assuming the offensive and threatening the federal capital, unquote. Similarly, Davis wrote on July 11th that Lee was alive, the word he used, to the potential of a northern offensive. And all of the conference's participants had long been aware of the desire by Davis and the others to secure Maryland's deliverance. The Herald's story, therefore, seemed to contain a core of truth. So having now reached mid-July 1862, let's sum all of this up. This slide shows where the sources say Jefferson Davis, Jackson, and others wanted to fight the war versus where they ended up having to defend against federal invasions of Virginia. So as we can see, the Confederacy can only rarely put up enough force to fulfill the president's vision. By July 15, 1862, Robert E. Lee, urged by Stonewall Jackson and encouraged by Davis, had decided to go on the attack. Now, most Civil War histories explain this change in policy as motivated by the desire to suppress the miscreant John Pope. These histories, however, miss the critical backstory of months of planning to push the war in Maryland and Pennsylvania that had preceded it. Now, destroying Pope's army would, of course, be Lee's initial objective, but it was not his ultimate goal. That was to liberate Maryland, push the war out of Virginia, and launch an offensive into Pennsylvania. Lee seems to have played a largely passive role in the design of much of this. Back in the spring of 1861, he had told Jackson to stay out of Maryland until it was clear that she would not secede. By the summer of '61, after it became obvious that Maryland could not or would not leave the Union, Lee and Davis began to discuss the possibility of using the Confederate Army to liberate the state from federal military occupation. Proposals for such action came in from Trimble in June, Beauregard in July. The Confederate military, however, was too weak to go on the attack, so nothing was done. Then, when Lee left Richmond for Western Virginia in July of 1861, Davis was left alone to mull over the prospect of launching an offensive on his own. He then entertained additional invasion plans from Beauregard, Johnston, and Smith, but found he could do nothing with them until his government could raise more troops and properly equip them. So little had changed by March of 1862 when Lee returned to Richmond. The Confederate Army remained too weak to do anything other than resist federal military advances. Jackson's operations in the Shenandoah Valley demonstrated the benefit of pursuing an aggressive policy versus standing on the defensive. But Lee and Davis now faced McClellan's army advancing toward Richmond on the York River Peninsula. In this situation, Lee again preferred to defend Richmond before taking any offensive action. Others did not agree, including Johnston and Jackson, who pressed for attacking north of the Potomac River. Davis agreed with these men, but understood Lee's position and deferred his decision to defend Richmond first. He nevertheless urged Lee to eventually carry the war into Africa when the opportunity arose, and Jackson continued to press for being aggressive. Lee then finally fell into line with the launch of the offensive to defeat Pope in July. Then immediately after Second Manassas, when he found himself, in his words, more fully persuaded. So that phrase lands differently when you know this. Of the benefits that would accrue from marching the army into Maryland, and so he ordered the operation to begin on September 2nd. In short, except for the 8 months from August 1861 to March 1862, General Lee had either participated in or borne witness to multiple discussions about initiating offensive Confederate military policy. Jefferson Davis played a key role in most of these talks and supported going on the attack from the very beginning of the war. Lee, by contrast, took a conservative position that stressed defending Virginia until it became clear that he possessed the men, the arms, and the initiative to change the policy. Now, estimates of the Army of Northern Virginia's strength at the start of Maryland campaign illustrate this point. Falling solidly between 64,000 and 76,000 men as of September 62. Back in October of 1861, Johnston, Beauregard, and Smith had told Davis that they needed 60,000 seasoned soldiers to push the war into Pennsylvania. By 1862, in September, Lee possessed that number of veterans and more. He could also rely on experienced and reliable lieutenant commanders. In February of 1862, 7 months after First Manassas, Johnston had complained that the Army was still, quote, crippled and its discipline greatly impaired by the want of general officers, unquote. The same could not be said 7 months later when that same Army counted Stonewall Jackson, Daniel Harvey Hill, Ambrose Powell Hill, Richard Herron Anderson, and Lafayette McLaws as commanders in its ranks. So in nearly every way, the Army of Northern Virginia in September of 1862 had overcome the weaknesses that had hamstrung it in October of '61. Feeding and clothing the men, of course, remained formidable challenges. But for now, General Lee stood on the threshold of realizing the dream that Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and others had envisioned for more than a year. The prospect of Maryland redeemed and Virginia avenged when communities north of the Mason-Dixon line finally felt the pains of invasion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alice, for enlightening.
Sure.
Do we have questions or comments?
I'm sure there must be some.
Gotta be some.
Many an invading army has assumed that they will be greeted as liberators,
right?
Only to find that they are not. Most recently, Russia and Ukraine. Was there perception, the Confederate perception that they would walk in and redeem Maryland or liberate Maryland, would that actually have happened if some of these bigger plans had gone through? Were they actually kind of was it actually more pro-Confederate than pro-Union?
I would say probably not. However, what Lee finds out when he enters Maryland is that secessionists in Frederick tell him at a dinner on September 6th that unless the Confederate Army will stay in the state and can prove that they can protect them from federal military retaliation, that there won't be an uprising on their part. And so Lee designs his plan to pull George McClellan west of South Mountain to fight him at a place called Beaver Creek, 2.5 miles north of Boonesboro, in order to win the decisive victory that he thought he needed to win in Maryland. In other words, he abandoned the Pennsylvania part of the operation almost immediately and developed a plan that eventually was defeated or hamstrung by the loss of his orders that General McClellan found or was given and moved a little bit faster than Lee expected him to move, and by Jackson taking 1 day longer to complete the Harper's Ferry operation than Lee had planned for. Lee had planned that the garrison would surrender by September 14th. The morning that George McClellan attacks the gaps at South Mountain, it doesn't happen until the next day. So it's 1 day late. And he writes that in his report too, that Jackson was 1 day late. And therefore he can't move north because even though it's kind of weird, when you're on South Mountain, it's almost like going to Boonesboro and then going north looks like going west. It's actually going north. So he can't move north, he has to move west, southwest, in order to be closer to Jackson's portion of the army, which is why he ends up fighting at Sharpsburg instead, to carry out the same plan, just in a different location. And then, I can't leave out Kentucky, which, Braxton and Bragg brings almost 20,000 muskets into Kentucky because they expect the ranks are going to be filled with volunteers and people who are just enthusiastic for the cause, and that doesn't happen either. And even though he installs a provisional governor in Frankfort on October 4th, actually Buell's plan was actually pretty good to counter his moves in that state, and he and E. Kirby Smith are pushed out so fast that they don't even have a chance to consolidate any kind of political support or anything. But Kentucky remains they're fat and happy on their bluegrass. Were there other questions? Yes, sir.
It just seems like Jackson, he wants to be very aggressive, but through the whole talk, it just seems like he's not aware of what the South lacks in terms of resources. He assumes there's all these men that are out there to be given to him and all this material that's there, and he persists with this aggressive strategy, and whereas Lee seems to be much more aware of the shortcomings. Mm-hmm. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that's fair observation.
Why is Jackson so much in the dark?
So I think part of it is simply flights of fancy. I mean, Jackson talks about going to Lake Erie. I mean, what are they going to walk? They're supposed to walk there? Because, I mean, these guys are walking, right? I mean, the scale of the offensive plans is far beyond the capacity of the Confederacy to complete. I mean, they're completely unrealistic. But yet that's what they focus on because they don't have anything else. Because at the same time this is happening in the West, Lee's fighting a holding action in the East. In the West, large pieces of territory are being gobbled up by basically the same kind of offensive strategy that Grant is employing, right? That Grant is employing out there to cut the Confederacy in half and then take portions of northern Mississippi and Georgia. And, I mean, look how long it took the Federal Army to complete the conquest of the South because of how vast the distances are. For the Confederacy, which is a far weaker force, to actually have imagined that this is possible, it's really, to me, it smacks of desperation. That's what it smacks of. And it also illustrates that Confederacy or Confederate offensive action is based on an awareness of their weakness, not of their strength.
Well, I guess that's what came across to me, was that their offensive action is based on their weakness.
Right.
But it's the very weakness that means they can't carry out the offense.
Exactly.
So
Which leads to the inevitable,
This together.
which leads to the inevitable conclusion that the South could never have won the war.
Yeah.
Which is something you hear debated all the time on Facebook, but the South never had a chance to win the war. And they knew that. Jefferson Davis knew that from the very beginning. Anyone else? Yes, Chris.
So that strength figure you gave going over the Potomac, it's well documented that a significant part of that army straggled. And that army, you were contrasting it to Grant earlier, I would contrast that army and what it had done in the period between Cedar Mountain and the end of the Maryland campaign with what Grant does in 44 days 2 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question I would have is, what's the difference? And B, even though the Confederates had the men in 1862, do they have the logistics to really pull off what they're trying to do, or do they overreach?
Sure. No, they do not have the logistics, and Lee knows this. Remember, the closest railhead's Gordonsville, and then they have to move supplies and provisions 100 miles by wagon, which they also don't have very much of. Lee mentions this at the beginning of the campaign when he writes to Davis and says that our army is feeble in transport. What that meant is, I got a bunch of guys on foot, and 1/3 of them are barefoot, and we don't have enough wagons to be able to transport what we need. So Lee's army, and this is a really bizarre part of what Lee has to accomplish in Maryland, is that it's a friendly state, right? They believe it's a friendly state, and they want to bring Marylanders into the Confederacy. So therefore, you can't allow your men to forage liberally on the land, but yet his army carries no food with it into Maryland. So they're supposed to live off the generosity of Marylanders and pay for everything that they use or take. So they have a bunch. These guys their pockets are stuffed with Confederate script before they leave. And they're supposed to pay. Here, I'm going to eat a bunch of apples. Here's $2 or whatever. But the Marylanders, they don't want the money because they can't bank it, so they consider it theft. You're giving me an IOU basically that's worthless. So what Lee intends to do then is he wants to move his supply line into the Shenandoah Valley, and then move the supplies up the Shenandoah, since he can defend the gaps there from federal cavalry and incursions, and create a large depot at Winchester. And that was supposed to be his operational center with a forward operating base at Hagerstown, so that he could then send Jackson's movable columns into southern Pennsylvania. That at least seems to be the outline of the plan that he had. The problem is that he wasn't in Maryland long enough. He was only in Maryland 13 days. So there's no way that he could actually make it happen. So the logistics, don't work. But by 1864, Grant has a far more developed logistical system. And doesn't Grant also have the benefit of rivers in the West that Lee doesn't have? And then when it comes to Confederate numbers, I'd say that between 7 and 10,000 men don't enter Maryland, even though the strength is, say, as much as 76,000. I think that's too high. I think it's really closer to 60, 64,000, somewhere in there. So if you take that, say you take 10,000 out, that's 54,000 men that he enters Maryland with. And as the Army encounters a cold reception in Maryland, a lot of the men just say, well, this place is not what we expected it to be, and they turn and they go south. The other thing that they expected is, we're going to Baltimore. And they're regaled with stories by Marylanders in the ranks of how beautiful the women are, and how much fun they're going to have, and how much liquor there is, and how they're going to have a grand old time, and they're going to eat to their heart's content, and everyone's going to have shoes, et cetera, et cetera. And what does Lee do? He goes northwest because he's not interested in going to Baltimore at that point in time. He wants to draw McClellan away from Washington. And so as soon as they start moving toward Pennsylvania, the straggling really begins. So I'll give you an example. Lafayette McLaws's strength, as of September 1st, his strength returns. McLaws's division By the time September 13th comes, so this is before a shot's been fired, there's another roll call that he takes in his division. He's lost 48% of his strength of men just going back to Virginia. So there was enthusiasm at the crossing and the belief that Maryland was going to rise to the occasion, and then when it doesn't, they just go, to hell with this, we're going back to Virginia, this isn't worth it. And so they go back and they forage all across Virginia. And by the time September 28th rolls around, so 11 days after the fight at Antietam, Lee's army's strength is back up to 52,000 men. And then in October, middle of October, it's up at 60, 65 or some 64,000 or something. So all these guys come back to the army. And then there were new recruits also sent from Richmond. And then by the time Fredericksburg happens, I think he's 75,000, 74,000 or something like that. But yeah, there are a lot of assumptions here that are being made, and I think this is one of the reasons why Lee has a much more realistic grasp on the situation, and why he's a lot more worried about the maintaining his army in the enemy's territory, because his guys, like I said, 1/3 of them are shoeless. They're not happy with the enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm they're being greeted with. They have no food. So this is a hellish kind of experience for them. And he knows that he can't realize what Davis's vision was for the campaign. And he says this in letters too. It's always couched in very gentle language. And I wish I could. You place great confidence in me, President Davis. I wish I had the same confidence that I could fulfill your wishes, which basically means, you have expectations that I can't meet.
Other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you, Alex.
Thank you.